The night Elias Boone walked into Red Hollow, 3 people lost something forever. One lost his pride. One lost her fear. And one lost control of the entire town. Rain hammered the desert road hard enough to turn the dust into black mud as Elias guided his horse through the edge of town. Red Hollow appeared slowly through the storm like something half forgotten by God. Crooked wooden buildings. Oil lamps flickering behind wet windows. A church steeple leaning slightly to one side as if even faith had grown tired there. Elias pulled the brim of his hat lower against the rain and kept riding. He had no intention of staying longer than an hour. Sell the horses. Drink coffee. Leave before sunrise. That had been the plan since Amarillo. Plans mattered to men who lived alone. And Elias Boone had been alone for a very long time. His horse snorted as they passed the town sign hanging by one rusted chain. Red Hollow. Population, 312. Somebody had scratched the number 312 away with a knife years ago. Elias understood why the second he heard shouting from inside the saloon. The sound cut through the storm sharp as broken glass. Not loud. Worse than loud. Familiar. Elias tied his horse beneath the awning and stood still for a moment while rainwater dripped from his coat sleeves. The Golden Coyote saloon glowed amber through the darkness ahead of him. Piano music stumbled badly inside. Laughter followed. Then silence. Elias hated silences like that. The kind where everyone suddenly remembered they had somewhere else to look. He pushed open the saloon doors anyway. Warm smoke rolled across his face the second he stepped inside. Whiskey. Wet wool. Cheap perfume. Muddy boots. 20 or 30 people crowded the room beneath lantern light stained gold with cigar smoke. Card players froze mid-hand. The piano player missed a note. Nobody knew Elias Boone by face anymore, but men like him carried a certain stillness into rooms. The kind people noticed without understanding why. Elias removed his glove slowly and walked toward the counter without speaking. Then he saw her. Clara Whitmore stood beside the bar holding a tray of whiskey glasses against her chest with both hands. Pretty wasn't the right word for her. Pretty belonged in dance halls and painted posters. Clara looked like the last clean thing in a dirty world. Blonde hair pinned carefully despite the storm outside. Pale blue dress with sleeves pulled to her wrists. A bruise hidden beneath powder near her cheekbone that most people would never notice. Most people weren't looking carefully. Elias was. Her hands trembled slightly while she poured a drink for a broad man leaning heavily against the counter. Harlan Pike. Even drunk, the man carried himself like he owned every inch of the room. Thick beard. Silver watch chain stretched across his vest. Mean eyes floating in whiskey. He grabbed Clara's wrist suddenly when she turned away. Not hard enough to leave marks. Hard enough to remind her he could. "You forgot my cigar," he said quietly. The room pretended not to hear. Clara lowered her eyes immediately. "I'll get it." Soft voice. Controlled voice. A woman used to surviving storms indoors. Elias sat at the far end of the counter while rain rattled against the windows. The bartender slid him coffee without asking. Passing through, the man muttered. Elias nodded once. Then came the sound. A whiskey glass slipping from nervous fingers. It shattered across the wooden floor near Clara's feet. Every head turned. Nobody breathed. Harlan stared at the broken glass for a long moment before slowly lifting his eyes toward his wife. Clara whispered something Elias couldn't hear. Probably an apology. Men like Harlan collected apologies the way gamblers collected cards. Never enough. Harlan smiled then. Calm smiles were always worse. "Look what you did," he said softly. Clara bent immediately to clean the mess before the whiskey reached his boots. The entire saloon watched her kneeling there in silence while thunder rolled outside. Elias Boone stared into his untouched coffee. And somewhere deep beneath 12 years of dust and loneliness, something old and dangerous began waking up again. The sound of the shattered glass still hung in the air long after the last piece stopped moving. Clara Whitmore remained kneeling on the wooden floor with her head lowered while whiskey slowly spread between the cracks beneath her hands. Nobody helped her. Nobody spoke. Rain whispered against the windows while thunder rolled somewhere far beyond the desert hills. Elias Boone sat motionless at the counter, one hand wrapped around the warm coffee mug the bartender had poured 5 minutes earlier. He had not taken a single drink. Across the room, Harlan Pike leaned against the bar with the lazy confidence of a man who had spent years teaching people to fear his moods. "Careful now," Harlan said softly to Clara. "You know how clumsy hands make me nervous." A few men forced weak laughs into the silence. Not because the joke was funny. Because fear always sounded a little like laughter in places such as Red Hollow. Clara whispered another apology and reached for the broken pieces near Harlan's boots. Elias noticed the small details others ignored. The way her fingers shook harder whenever Harlan moved too suddenly. The way she measured every word before speaking it. The way the entire saloon watched her without truly seeing her at all. Like she had become part of the furniture years ago. The piano player quietly resumed a slow tune in the corner. Something soft and tired. Elias finally lifted the coffee to his mouth, but before he could drink, Clara reached for one sharp piece of glass and cut her finger. It was only a tiny cut. Barely enough to matter. Yet she froze instantly as though she had done something unforgivable. A small drop of blood touched the floorboards. Harlan's jaw tightened. "Now look at that," he muttered. "You cannot even clean properly." Clara quickly grabbed a rag and wiped the floor while murmuring apologies under her breath. Elias set the coffee down untouched once again. The old feeling inside him grew heavier. Not anger. Anger burned hot and fast. This was colder than anger. Older too. The bartender noticed the change in his eyes and quietly leaned closer. "Best stay out of it," the man whispered while polishing a glass that was already clean. "Harlan owns half the buildings in town." Elias looked toward Clara again. "What does he own the other half with?" The bartender hesitated. Then he glanced toward the revolver beneath Harlan's coat. "Fear," he answered quietly. Elias said nothing after that. He simply watched. A rancher near the fireplace lowered his voice toward another man. "Poor girl used to smile once," he muttered. "Long time ago." "Before she married him?" the other asked. The rancher nodded slowly. "Before Red Hollow stopped noticing." Those words stayed with Elias more than they should have. Outside, wind pushed rain sideways against the saloon windows while travelers hurried across muddy streets beneath flickering lanterns. Inside, Clara rose carefully to her feet with the tray gathered against her chest once more. She moved through the table silently refilling drinks, avoiding eye contact with everyone except Elias. And even then it lasted less than a second. But that second was enough. Elias saw something hidden beneath the fear. Exhaustion. The kind carried by people who had spent too many years hoping tomorrow might finally be kinder than today. Harlan followed her with his eyes the entire time. Watching. Controlling. Measuring every breath she took. Then suddenly the saloon doors burst open beneath a blast of cold wind. 3 riders stepped inside soaked from the storm, their boots heavy with mud. One of them laughed loudly the moment he saw Harlan. "Still keeping your little songbird on a leash, hey," he called across the room. Several men looked down at their drinks immediately. Clara froze beside the piano. Harlan smiled slowly and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Best behaved woman in the territory," he announced proudly. Clara forced a faint smile that never reached her eyes. Elias Boone stared into his coffee again, but now his hand tightened around the mug hard enough for the ceramic to groan softly beneath his fingers. Because 20 years earlier, in another saloon nearly 300 miles away, he had once watched his own mother smile exactly the same way. The memory hit Elias Boone harder than the smell of whiskey ever could. For a moment, the noise inside the saloon faded beneath the sound of another storm from another year. Different town. Different walls. Same silence. He remembered sitting beneath a staircase at 9 years old while his mother forced smiles through trembling lips so neighbors would not ask questions nobody intended to answer. He remembered men staring into their drinks the same way these men were staring now. Most of all, he remembered the feeling afterward. The shame of surviving quietly. Elias blinked once and the memory disappeared, but the weight remained behind his ribs like cold iron. Across the room, Harlan Pike laughed loudly with the 3 riders who had entered from the storm. Clara moved between tables carrying drinks with careful hands while lantern light flickered across her face. Every few seconds she brushed loose strands of blonde hair behind one ear, almost like a nervous habit she no longer realized she had. Elias noticed things like that. Men who spent years alone became observers whether they wanted to or not. One of the riders leaned back in his chair and watched Clara pass. "You ought to charge people just to look at her," he joked toward Harlan. Harlan grinned proudly. "Careful now. She hears compliments and starts thinking she deserves them." The men laughed again. Clara lowered her eyes and continued walking. Elias felt the coffee cool untouched in front of him. "You know," the bartender muttered quietly while wiping the counter, "there was a time folks used to step in." Elias glanced sideways without speaking. The bartender shrugged weakly. Then one deputy disappeared. Then another left town. Eventually people learned keeping quiet was healthier. "Healthy is not the same thing as right," Elias replied. The bartender stopped polishing the glass for a second. It was the first full sentence Elias had spoken since entering Red Hollow. Before the man could answer, Clara approached the counter carrying an empty tray. Up close, Elias noticed how tired her eyes truly looked. Not sleepy. Drained. Like somebody who had spent years carrying invisible weight across endless miles. She placed the tray beside him carefully. "More coffee?" she asked softly without meeting his eyes. Elias nodded once. Clara reached for the pot with both hands. One sleeve slipped slightly down her wrist as she poured, revealing faint marks near her forearm before she quickly pulled the fabric back into place. Elias looked away immediately. Not because he had not seen them. Because he had. Clara noticed that too. For the first time all night, her eyes lifted toward his face. Just 1 second. Long enough for confusion to cross her expression. Most men stared too long at wounded things. Elias had looked away out of respect. That seemed to surprise her more than kindness would have. Passing through, she asked quietly. "Before sunrise," Elias answered. Clara gave a small nod as though people always left eventually. Harlan suddenly called her name from across the room. Not loudly. Somehow worse, softly. Clara straightened immediately. "Coming," she answered. She turned to leave, but Harlan spoke again. "Bring the gentleman another drink too. He looks lonely." A few chuckles drifted through the saloon. Elias remained still while Clara reached for a whiskey bottle near the counter. Then she paused. Her fingers hovered uncertainly above it. Elias understood immediately. She had noticed his untouched coffee. "I do not drink whiskey," he said calmly. Harlan raised an eyebrow from across the room. "No?" Elias slowly met his gaze for the first time that night. The saloon grew quiet all over again. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The piano stopped. Even the lantern flames seemed smaller somehow. "No," Elias repeated. Harlan studied him with narrowing eyes, measuring the stranger sitting alone beneath the window. Men like Harlan trusted fear the same way ranchers trusted fences. The moment fear stopped working, they sensed it immediately. Clara remained frozen beside the counter holding the whiskey bottle against her chest while tension drifted through the room thick as cigar smoke. Then Harlan smiled again. "Easy. Relaxed. Dangerous. Well," he said slowly, "every man has his poison." Elias looked down into the dark surface of his coffee. Some poisons just take longer to kill you. Nobody laughed this time. And somewhere deep inside Red Hollow, something subtle began shifting beneath the weight of that silence. The silence after Elias Boone's words felt heavier than the storm outside. Nobody in the saloon moved right away. Men stared into whiskey glasses. Cards remained untouched on tables. Even the lantern flames seemed to wait for something. Harlan Pike leaned back slowly in his chair near the fireplace while Clara stood beside the counter holding the bottle against her chest like she had forgotten what to do with her hands. Then Harlan laughed. Calm at first. Low and easy. But there was no warmth in it. Well now, he said, adjusting the silver watch chain across his vest, that explains the coat. A few uncertain chuckles drifted around the room. Harlan pointed lazily toward Elias with his cigar. Only men carrying ghosts drink coffee in a saloon. Elias finally lifted the mug and took his first sip of the night. Bitter. Cold already. He did not seem bothered by either. Harlan studied him harder now. Men such as Harlan always searched for weakness once fear failed. You got a name, cowboy? He asked. Elias set the mug down carefully before answering. Elias Boone. The name traveled quietly through the room. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But Elias noticed two older ranchers glance toward each other near the fireplace. One of them muttered something under his breath. Clara heard it too. Her eyes lifted slightly. Boone? Harlan repeated. You the same Boone that worked cattle drives through New Mexico? Elias nodded once. Used to. Harlan smirked. Heard stories about you. Elias looked toward the rain running down the window beside him. Most stories get bigger after whiskey. One of the riders barked a laugh at that, but Harlan did not. He kept watching Elias carefully now, measuring him the same way gamblers measured a dangerous hand of cards. Clara quietly moved around the tables collecting empty glasses while tension stretched tighter through the saloon. Every few minutes Harlan glanced toward her as if checking she remained exactly where he wanted. Ownership. That was what Elias hated most. Not cruelty itself. The ownership behind it. The belief that another human being could slowly become something smaller through fear. Clara passed beside Elias again carrying a tray crowded with empty bottles. One glass slipped sideways near the edge. Instinctively, Elias reached out and steadied it before it could fall. Their hands touched for less than a second. Clara immediately pulled back slightly, startled by the gentleness more than the contact itself. Thank you, she whispered. Elias simply nodded. Harlan noticed everything. His eyes narrowed almost invisibly from across the room. Clara, he called softly. Too softly. The kind of softness that carried warning beneath it. Clara straightened instantly. Yes? Come here. The saloon grew quiet again as she crossed the room toward him. Harlan rested one arm across the back of his chair while the three riders watched with amused expressions. Tell me something, Harlan said loud enough for half the room to hear. Did I marry you because you were graceful? Clara remained standing beside him with her hands folded carefully together. No, did I marry you because you were clever? No, Harlan smiled slowly. Then why did I marry you? Clara hesitated just long enough for the room to feel it. Because you chose me, she answered quietly. Harlan nodded with satisfaction. That is right. Elias stared at the coffee mug again, but his jaw tightened slightly. Across the room, one older rancher looked away completely, ashamed to keep watching. Harlan gestured toward the piano player. Music stopped again, he muttered. The piano immediately resumed, though the notes sounded nervous now. Rain thundered harder outside. Wind rattled the windows. Clara turned to leave, but Harlan caught the edge of her sleeve lightly between two fingers. You forgot something, he said. Clara paused. What? Harlan looked toward Elias Boone sitting alone at the counter. Smile. The room fell still once more. Clara tried. God help her, she truly tried. A small fragile smile touched her lips, but it looked painful somehow. Like sunlight appearing in winter for only a second before disappearing again. Elias Boone watched that smile carefully. Then he stood up. Slow. Quiet. Heavy boots against old wooden floors. Every head in the saloon turned toward him at once. Even Harlan stopped smiling. Elias reached into his coat pocket and placed $3 silver on the counter beside his untouched coffee. Bartender, he said calmly, rent me a room for the night. Outside, lightning split across the black Texas sky while 12 horses shifted restlessly beneath the rain. The moment Elias Boone asked for a room, the entire saloon changed. Not loudly. Quietly. Like air shifting before a tornado reaches town. The bartender stopped wiping the counter. The piano player missed 2 notes in a row. One of the older ranchers near the fireplace slowly lowered his whiskey glass without taking a drink. Because men did not stay overnight in Red Hollow unless they belonged there or planned to fight somebody who did. Harlan Pike leaned back in his chair watching Elias carefully through cigar smoke curling toward the ceiling. Storm bad enough to scare you off the road? He asked casually. Elias removed his gloves one finger at a time. Storms do not bother me. Then why stay? Elias looked toward the staircase leading to the rooms above the saloon. Coffee tasted bad. A few nervous chuckles drifted across the room again. Harlan smiled thinly, but the humor never touched his eyes. Clara remained beside him, still holding that fragile smile he had ordered onto her face moments earlier. Elias noticed the instant it disappeared once Harlan stopped looking directly at her. Like a candle finally allowed to stop pretending it could outshine the dark. The bartender cleared his throat awkwardly. Room number 4 is empty, he muttered while reaching beneath the counter for a brass key. Only one left. Elias placed another silver dollar beside the first 3. Feed my horse too? Of course. Harlan suddenly stood from his chair. The movement alone tightened the room again. He adjusted his vest slowly and walked toward Elias with boots heavy against the floorboards. Nobody spoke while he crossed the saloon. Clara lowered her eyes immediately the closer he came to the counter. Harlan stopped beside Elias, close enough to smell the rain still clinging to his coat. You know, Harlan said softly, Red Hollow used to get all kinds drifting through. Gamblers. Hunters. Men running from warrants. They all learned something eventually. Elias slid the brass room key into his coat pocket. What was that? Harlan smiled. Some towns are easier to leave than change. Silence again. Thick. Heavy. Dangerous in a way words never quite managed to explain. Elias finally looked directly at him. I am not here to change anything. Harlan studied his face for a long second, trying to decide whether he believed him. Then Clara suddenly spoke from behind them. Your dinner is getting cold. Her voice was quiet, but every head still turned toward her. Harlan glanced back slowly. Clara immediately lowered her gaze again, perhaps regretting speaking at all. But something strange happened then. For the first time that night, Elias saw irritation flicker across Harlan's face, not because Clara had interrupted him, but because she had interrupted him in front of another man. Pride. That was the real poison inside men like Harlan. Pride mixed with fear. Harlan forced another smile and stepped away from the counter. My wife worries too much, he announced toward the room. It is charming at first. Then exhausting. The riders laughed obediently. Clara moved toward the kitchen doors carrying empty glasses against her chest while Harlan returned to his table beside the fireplace. Elias watched her disappear behind the swinging doors before finally reaching for the coffee again. You should leave before morning, the bartender whispered quietly while pretending to clean bottles. Elias took a slow sip. You tell every traveler that. Only the ones dumb enough to stare back at Harlan Pike. Elias looked around the saloon once more. Smoke hanging beneath lantern light. Men pretending not to notice suffering sitting 5 feet away from them. Clara returning from the kitchen carrying plates with careful hands. Outside, rainwater sliding through muddy streets nobody bothered cleaning anymore. What happened to this town? Elias asked quietly. The bartender hesitated before answering. Nothing happened all at once. That is the problem. Elias understood immediately. Evil rarely arrived with gunfire. Usually it arrived one compromise at a time. One silence at a time. One excuse at a time. Clara approached Harlan's table carrying his dinner plate carefully. With both hands. Harlan did not thank her. Did not even look at her. One of the riders leaned back in his chair watching her move through the lantern light. You ought to sing again sometime, he said casually. Clara paused slightly. I do not sing anymore. She used to, another rider added with a grin. Whole town came running when she sang at church. Harlan cut into his steak without looking up. Then she married me and learned quieter hobbies. The riders laughed. But Elias noticed something else. Clara's face changed for half a second at those words. Not fear this time. Grief. Real grief. As though somewhere beneath all the silence and obedience, another version of her still existed. One that remembered music. Elias Boone stared into the dark coffee again while thunder rolled low across the plains outside Red Hollow. And for the first time in years, he began wondering whether leaving before sunrise might no longer be possible. The saloon settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal, but Elias Boone could feel how fragile that normality really was. It was the kind of calm that only existed because everyone inside had agreed, silently and without words, not to break it. Clara moved between tables again, but something in her posture had changed since the kitchen conversation. Her shoulders were still lowered, her steps still careful, but now there was a distance in her eyes, like part of her mind had drifted far beyond the wooden walls of Red Hollow. Elias watched her from the counter without making it obvious. Men like him had learned long ago that attention could be dangerous in places where control mattered more than truth. Harlan Pike sat near the fireplace cutting into his meal with slow, deliberate movements. Every so often, he would glance up, not at Clara, but at Elias, as if measuring how long the stranger intended to remain in his world. The riders who had arrived earlier were now louder, more comfortable, as if the alcohol and Harlan's presence had given them permission to forget restraint. You really came through here alone, one of them asked Elias suddenly, leaning back in his chair. Elias nodded once. Most people travel alone through here if they are smart. The rider laughed. Or foolish. Elias did not respond. Harlan leaned forward slightly. He is not foolish, Harlan said. Just passing through. That is all. Clara returned with a fresh bottle, placing it carefully on the table beside Harlan without meeting his eyes. Her hand trembled slightly as she set it down. Harlan noticed. He always noticed. Careful, he said softly. Clara nodded quickly and stepped back. Elias noticed the pattern now. Every movement Clara made was measured not by comfort, but by anticipation of correction. Not punishment. Correction. That difference mattered more than most people realized. The bartender approached Elias again, lowering his voice as he refilled the coffee pot. You ever notice how some people stop speaking unless spoken to? Elias looked at him. Yes. That is what happens here, the bartender said. Slowly. Over time. Elias glanced toward Clara again. She was standing near the piano now, listening to one of the riders tell a story about a cattle drive gone wrong. She smiled politely at the correct moments, but the smile never reached her eyes. It was the same kind of practiced expression Elias had seen before in places where survival depended on pleasing people who did not deserve it. Harlan suddenly raised his voice slightly across the room. Clara, bring more whiskey. Clara turned immediately. Yes. She moved without hesitation, but Elias noticed the pause she took before walking. Just 1 second. A small delay that no one else seemed to see. It looked like hesitation wrapped in obedience. As she passed the counter again, Elias spoke quietly without looking directly at her. "You do not have to move that fast." Clara stopped for a fraction of a second. Her eyes flicked toward him, surprised by the statement. No man in this town spoke to her that way. Not even softly. Not even by accident. "It is fine," she replied quickly, almost reflexively, and continued walking. Harland watched the exchange from across the room, his expression unreadable now. Not angry. Not amused. Something closer to calculation. Outside, wind pushed harder against the windows, and the lantern light inside the saloon flickered briefly, casting long shadows across the floorboards. The piano player slowed his playing again without explanation. One of the riders near the door shifted in his seat, suddenly less interested in conversation. Elias finished his coffee and set the cup down carefully. "How long has she been married to him?" he asked the bartender quietly. The bartender hesitated before answering. 3 years. Maybe a little more. Elias nodded once, as if confirming something only he could see forming in his mind. "And before that?" "She worked at the church," the bartender said. "Sang. Helped with Sunday gatherings. People said she had a good voice." Elias looked toward Clara again as she returned to Harland's table with another glass. There was something almost invisible in the way she held herself now. A memory of something softer, buried under repetition and expectation. Harland said something to her that made her nod immediately. She set the glass down and stepped back again. Elias stood slowly from his chair. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. Just enough for the room to notice. Conversations faded slightly without stopping completely. Harland's eyes followed him immediately. "Leaving already?" Harland asked. Elias picked up his coat from the back of the chair. "Not yet." Harland studied him again, longer this time. Clara looked up briefly at Elias as he moved toward the stairs. Their eyes met for a moment. No words. No acknowledgement beyond recognition. Then Elias continued upward, each step of the wooden staircase creaking softly beneath his boots. Behind him, the saloon returned to its uneasy rhythm, but something had changed. Not visibly. Not loudly. Only in the way people occasionally paused a little longer before speaking, as if remembering that someone new was now staying in room number 4 above them. The stairs creaked softly beneath Elias Boone's boots as he climbed toward room number 4, each step carrying a weight that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with awareness. The sound of the saloon below faded gradually into a muffled hum, laughter, and clinking glasses blending together like a distant memory that did not belong to him. At the top of the staircase, a narrow hallway stretched under dim lantern light, the wood walls worn smooth by years of passing travelers who never stayed long enough to be remembered. Room number 4 was at the end. The key turned easily in the lock. Inside, the room was small, simple, and clean in a way that felt almost unfamiliar in Red Hollow. A bed with a thin wool blanket. A wooden chair near a cracked window. A basin of water that had not yet been used. Elias closed the door behind him but did not sit down immediately. Instead, he stood near the window and looked out over the town. From above, Red Hollow appeared quieter than it felt from inside it. The lanterns in the street flickered against wet wooden sidewalks, and the saloon sign creaked slightly in the wind. Beyond that, nothing but darkness and rain stretching into the Texas plains. Somewhere below, Clara Whitmore was still working, still moving between tables, still carrying a version of herself shaped entirely by expectation. Elias exhaled slowly, removing his coat and placing it over the back of the chair. He had stayed in rooms like this before in other towns. Rooms where nothing changed except the names on the signs outside. Yet something about this place refused to feel temporary. There was a heaviness here that clung to people rather than buildings. A kind of quiet agreement among those who lived in it. Downstairs, Harland Pike's voice rose briefly, followed by the low laughter of his riders. Elias could not hear the words clearly, but he understood tone well enough. Confidence mixed with ownership. The kind of confidence that never questioned itself. Elias sat on the edge of the bed finally, resting his elbows on his knees. His mind drifted back without permission, not to Harland, not to the saloon, but to another night long ago when silence had meant something different. A smaller room. A different town. A woman singing softly near a fireplace while pretending not to notice the men who stopped listening when she began. His mother's voice had been like that once. Gentle but fading under the weight of being unheard. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again just as a faint sound rose from below. Not conversation. Not laughter. Something softer. Music. The piano had started again, but it was different now. Slower. Less confident. And beneath it, barely audible, Clara's voice. Elias stood up without thinking and moved closer to the window. From his angle, he could not see inside the saloon, but he could imagine it. Clara standing near the piano, hesitating before each note, rediscovering something she had buried too deep to remember easily. The sound carried upward through the night air like something fragile refusing to disappear completely. Elias remained still, listening. The voice was not strong, but it did not need to be. It carried something more dangerous than strength. Memory. Downstairs, conversation slowly softened again as if people were unsure whether they were allowed to hear what they were hearing. Even Harland's table had gone quieter. Elias could picture him watching, not smiling now, but studying the room as though trying to decide whether this moment belonged to him or not. Clara's voice continued for only a short time before fading slightly, not because she stopped, but because the piano hesitated beside her. Elias could feel the shift even from above. Something delicate had been exposed in a place that survived on control. He turned away from the window and sat back down on the bed, staring at his hands for a long moment. They were steady. Always steady. That was the problem. Men who stayed steady for too long eventually forgot what it felt like to move without calculation. A knock came at the door. Soft. Measured. Elias did not respond immediately. The knock came again, slightly more hesitant. He stood and opened the door slowly. Clara Whitmore stood in the hallway holding an empty tray against her chest. Her hair was slightly loosened now from the earlier hours, a few strands falling near her face. She looked different away from the saloon light. Less composed. More human. "I am sorry to disturb you," she said quietly. Elias stepped aside without speaking, allowing her to enter if she wished. She hesitated for a moment before remaining in the doorway instead. "I just needed to collect the cups from earlier," she added. Elias nodded once. Clara lowered her gaze briefly, then glanced toward the window behind him. "You heard the music?" she asked softly. "Yes," Elias replied. A pause followed. Not uncomfortable. Just heavy with things neither of them said. Clara tightened her grip on the tray slightly. "It has been a long time," she said, almost to herself. Elias looked at her carefully. "Long time since what?" Clara hesitated again, as if the answer was something she had stopped giving herself permission to say out loud. "Since I forgot what my voice sounded like without asking permission first." The words hung between them in the small room. Downstairs, the saloon noise returned faintly as someone resumed conversation, but it felt distant now, like another world entirely. Elias Boone remained still, watching her carefully, not interrupting, not correcting, not filling the silence. Outside, rain continued to fall over Red Hollow, but for the first time since arriving, Elias felt something shift that had nothing to do with the storm. Something was beginning to wake up in the town below. And it was not coming from the men who thought they controlled it. The night in Red Hollow had changed its tone without warning, as if the town itself had shifted its attention from noise to something quieter, something more fragile. Elias Boone stood in room number 4 with the door still slightly open behind him, listening as Clara Whitmore finished her sentence, and the silence that followed felt heavier than anything said aloud. She remained in the doorway, not stepping inside, as if crossing that line required permission she had not been given in years. Downstairs, the saloon continued its life in fragments, glass clinking, chairs shifting, a low murmur of voices trying to pretend nothing unusual had happened. But something had happened. Elias could feel it the way a man feels a change in wind before a storm arrives. Clara tightened her grip on the empty tray, her eyes briefly lowering toward the floorboards of the hallway. "I should go," she said softly, though her body did not move. Elias did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at her the way a man looks at a locked door he is not sure he should open. "You do not have to rush," he finally said. The words were simple, almost ordinary, but they landed differently in the narrow hallway. Clara blinked once, as if trying to understand whether she had heard them correctly. No one in Red Hollow spoke to her that way. Not customers. Not townspeople. Not even Harlan Pike when he was pretending to be kind. "I am not used to not rushing," she replied quietly. Elias leaned slightly against the wall beside the door, giving her space without closing it. "That does not mean you have to keep doing it," he said. A faint sound drifted up from the saloon below again, the piano hesitating before finding its rhythm. Clara glanced downward instinctively, as if she could see through the floorboards into the room beneath them. "When I sing," she said after a moment, "it feels like I am borrowing something that does not belong to me anymore." Elias watched her carefully. "Does it belong to Harlan?" he asked. Clara shook her head immediately, almost too quickly. "No," she said, then paused. "Nothing about it ever did." A silence followed, but it was different from the others that filled this town. It was not forced. It was not heavy with fear. It was simply uncertain. Downstairs, a burst of laughter briefly broke through, then faded again. The saloon was still alive, but it no longer felt confident in its own noise. Clara stepped back slightly into the hallway, still not entering the room, but no longer retreating either. "He does not like when I sing," she said softly. "He says it makes people think too much." Elias nodded slowly. "People who benefit from silence usually do." Clara looked at him then, more directly than before. There was something searching in her expression, as if she was trying to determine whether he was dangerous in a way she understood or dangerous in a way she did not yet recognize. "Why did you stop moving when I started singing?" she asked. Elias considered the question for a moment. "Because it was not something I wanted to interrupt." Clara seemed to absorb that answer carefully, like someone turning a fragile object over in their hands. From below, the piano began again, this time steadier, as if the musician had decided not to stop. Clara closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, something in her posture had changed slightly. Not confidence. Not yet. But something closer to recognition. "I used to think I would leave here one day," she said quietly. "Before it became too late." Elias looked toward the window at the end of the hallway where rain continued to fall against the glass. "It is never too late to leave," he said. Clara gave a small, almost invisible smile, but it carried no humor. "That is what people say who have already left," she replied. Elias did not argue. Instead, he simply said, "Sometimes staying is harder than leaving." The words lingered between them again, heavier this time, because neither of them needed to explain what they meant. Downstairs, Harlan Pike's voice suddenly rose, cutting through the distance like a sharp edge returning to familiar ground. Clara tensed immediately at the sound, her shoulders tightening instinctively. Elias noticed the reaction without looking toward the stairs. "You do not need to go back right away," he said calmly. Clara hesitated. Her hand tightened on the tray once more, then slowly loosened. For the first time, she did not move immediately when summoned by a voice from below. That small pause felt larger than anything that had happened all night. Somewhere in the saloon, a glass was set down harder than necessary. A chair scraped against the floor. Harlan's tone dropped again, lower now, more controlled. Clara exhaled softly. "If I stay up here too long," she said, "he will notice." Elias met her eyes. He will notice anyway, he replied. That truth hung in the air without judgment, without instruction, only observation. Clara looked down the hallway toward the stairs leading back into the saloon, then back at Elias. For a brief moment, it seemed as if she was deciding something she had never been allowed to decide before. Finally, she stepped fully into the doorway of room number 4. Not entering deeply. Not leaving either. Just crossing a line she had never crossed before without permission. I do not know what happens after this, she said. Quietly. Elias nodded once. Neither do I, he answered. And for the first time since the storm began, the silence between them did not feel like something waiting to break. It felt like something waiting to begin. Clara Whitmore remained standing in the doorway of room number 4, her hand still resting lightly on the edge of the wooden frame as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the present moment. Behind her, the hallway stretched back toward the staircase and the distant sound of the saloon below, where life continued in uneven rhythms of laughter, conversation, and the faint echo of a piano that no longer played with certainty. In front of her, Elias Boone stood still, not moving closer, not stepping away, simply allowing the space between them to exist without pressure. It was the first time in years Clara could remember being near a man who did not try to fill silence with control. Downstairs, Harland Pike's voice rose again, sharper now, cutting through the softened atmosphere like a blade returning to its sheath. Clara, he called from below, not loudly, but with a tone that carried expectation more than volume. Every sound in the saloon seemed to react to it. A chair shifted. A glass was placed down more carefully than before. Even the piano faltered slightly before continuing. Clara closed her eyes for a brief moment. It was not fear that crossed her face, but something heavier, something shaped by repetition rather than surprise. Elias noticed that difference. Fear was sudden. This was practiced. He is calling, she said quietly, though she did not move immediately. Elias nodded once. I heard him. A pause followed. Not empty, but full of unspoken weight. Clara opened her eyes again and looked down the hallway toward the stairs. The wood beneath her feet felt thinner now, as if the boundary between upstairs and downstairs had become more fragile than it had been all night. If I do not go back right away, she said, he will come looking. Elias remained calm, his voice steady but low. Then let him come. The simplicity of that response seemed to disturb the balance she had lived inside for years. Clara turned her head slightly toward him. You do not understand what that means here, she said softly. Elias met her gaze. Then explain it to me. Clara hesitated. Not because she did not know the words, but because she was not used to using them without consequence. It means people notice when I am gone, she said. And when people notice, things change. Elias studied her carefully. Change is not always something to avoid. Downstairs, Harland's voice called again, closer this time, as if he had moved toward the base of the stairs. The tone was still controlled, but there was a tighter edge beneath it now, like patience being deliberately maintained rather than naturally held. Clara's fingers tightened briefly on the doorframe. He does not like when I hesitate, she said. Elias glanced toward the stairwell. He is already used to you not hesitating, he replied. That sentence lingered in the air longer than the others. Clara looked at him again, and for the first time, there was something different in her expression. Not defiance yet. Not escape. But recognition of possibility. The idea that hesitation itself might not be wrong. From below, footsteps moved slightly, not rushing, but deliberate. Harland was coming closer. The saloon's background noise softened again, as if the entire room was beginning to listen more carefully. Clara took a slow breath. When I stay up here too long, she said, he assumes I am being difficult. Elias responded without hesitation. Maybe the problem is not that you are difficult. Clara gave a faint, uncertain look. Then what is it? Elias paused for a moment, choosing words carefully. Maybe the problem is that you are only seen when you are easy. That answer landed differently than anything she had heard before. Clara lowered her gaze briefly, as if testing the meaning against years of lived experience. It did not fit what she had been told about herself. Downstairs, Harlan's footsteps reached the bottom of the staircase. He did not speak immediately. Instead, the silence that followed felt intentional, as if he was listening for something before deciding how to enter the moment. Clara shifted slightly but did not step back into the hallway. She remained in the doorway. Half inside, half outside. A space she had never occupied before. Elias noticed that too. "You do not have to decide everything tonight," he said quietly. Clara looked up at him again. "I do not think I have ever decided anything," she replied. The honesty in her voice was softer than anything she had said before. Harlan's presence now filled the lower end of the stairs without him fully appearing. His voice rose again, calm but unmistakably firm. "Clara! Come down." The words were not loud, but they carried the weight of habit. Clara did not move immediately. That alone changed the air. Elias Boone remained still, watching her carefully, not pushing, not guiding, simply present. For a brief moment, the entire building seemed to hold its breath. Clara's eyes shifted between the stairs and the room behind her. Then, slowly, she stepped fully into room number 4. Not retreating. Not advancing. Just choosing stillness where movement had always been expected. Downstairs, Harlan did not speak again right away. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was uncertain. And in that uncertainty, something in Red Hollow began to feel, for the first time, like it might no longer respond the way it always had. The room did not move, but everything inside it changed the moment Clara Whitmore failed to obey the silence expected of her. Harlan Pike stood in the doorway, one hand resting lightly against the wooden frame, his posture calm enough to suggest patience but controlled enough to make that patience feel like a warning. Elias Boone remained exactly where he had been, not stepping forward, not stepping back, only watching the space between them as if distance itself mattered more than words. Clara stood between both men now without meaning to, her body angled slightly toward Harlan, but her eyes still uncertain, still caught between instruction and something she had not practiced in years. Downstairs, the saloon continued its life in muted fragments, but even from here Elias could feel that people were listening harder than before. Harlan finally spoke again, his voice still even. "I told you to go downstairs." Clara lowered her gaze. Briefly, then lifted it again. "I am here," she said softly, "because there is a conversation happening." Harlan did not react immediately. That absence of reaction was more dangerous than anger. He slowly shifted his attention toward Elias. "There is no conversation," he said. Elias answered calmly. "Then it should end quickly." A faint pause followed, the kind that made the air itself feel heavier. Harlan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in rage, but in calculation. "You do not understand how things are kept in order here," he said. Elias nodded once. "Order is what people call it when they are afraid to speak differently." The words were not loud, but they landed in a way that changed Clara's breathing slightly. She looked at Elias more directly now, as if trying to understand where that kind of certainty came from. Harlan stepped further into the room, just enough to close the space between them without touching it. "You are a guest," he said. Elias replied without hesitation. "Then treat me like one." The simplicity of the answer created a brief silence that even Harlan did not immediately fill. Clara shifted her weight slightly, her hands still loosely together in front of her. "Maybe this does not need to continue," she said quietly. Both men looked at her at the same time. That alone was enough to make her pause. She had not been used to being the center of attention in a way that was not controlled by instruction. Harlan spoke first. "Go downstairs," he repeated. This time the words were not patient. They were final in tone, though still quiet. Clara did not move. Elias noticed that more than anything else. Not the defiance itself, but the delay before obedience that had always been immediate before. Harlan noticed it as well. That realization shifted something subtle in his expression, though he kept his voice level. Clara, he said again, slower now. Clara took a small breath. For a moment, it looked as if she might comply automatically, as she always had. Her eyes flicked toward the door, then toward the hallway behind Harland, then finally toward Elias Boone. In that brief sequence, something unfamiliar appeared in her posture. Not resistance yet, but awareness that choice itself was still possible. "I am not refusing," she said quietly. Harland tilted his head slightly. "Then move." Clara remained still for another second. That second felt longer than it should have. Elias did not intervene. He only observed, as if understanding that anything spoken now would either collapse or change everything in ways that could not be undone. Finally, Clara took a step, but not toward the door. She stepped sideways instead, placing herself no longer in the center between them, but slightly closer to Elias than to Harland. It was a small movement, almost unnoticeable to someone not paying attention. But Harland noticed. The change in distance was enough. His expression did not harden, but it quieted further, as if something had been confirmed that he had already suspected but not yet named. "You are making this complicated," he said softly. Elias responded evenly. "It is already complicated." Harland exhaled slowly through his nose, then turned his gaze back to Clara. "Last time," he said. Clara looked at him. This time, she did not immediately lower her eyes. That alone altered the shape of the moment. "I am here," she said again, more steady than before, "because I am part of this conversation whether I am allowed to be or not." The words hung in the air without echo, as if even the room was uncertain how to receive them. Harland did not respond right away. Instead, he looked at her for a long moment, then at Elias Boone, then back again. Something in his control remained intact, but something else beneath it had shifted slightly out of alignment. Downstairs, the saloon noise faded briefly again, as if the people below had sensed the change without knowing why. Elias finally spoke, his voice calm but deliberate. "You asked earlier what I understand," he said to Harland. "I understand this." He paused. "Silence is not the same thing as peace." Harland did not answer immediately. Clara stood between them now, no longer placed there by circumstance alone, but by decision that neither man had directly caused. Outside, rain continued to fall over Red Hollow in steady sheets, but inside room number 4, something irreversible had begun to take shape in the space where silence had always been expected to remain. The air inside room number 4 felt thinner now, as if every word spoken had taken something from it that could not easily be replaced. Clara Whitmore stood slightly closer to Elias Boone than before, not in defiance, not in agreement, but in a position that no longer matched the pattern she had lived inside for years. Harland Pike remained near the doorway, still, composed, his presence filling the threshold without needing to move further. The rain outside continued its steady rhythm against the town, but inside, even that sound seemed distant. Elias spoke first, his voice steady but quiet. "You are not asking the right question," he said to Harland. Harland's gaze remained fixed. "And what is the right question?" Elias did not rush his answer. He looked briefly at Clara, then back at Harland. "Not why she is here," he said. "But why she has never been allowed to stay anywhere else." Clara's eyes lowered slightly at those words, not from shame, but from recognition of something she had never been asked before. Harland did not respond immediately. The silence stretched, measured and controlled, as if he was deciding whether the conversation was still his to manage. Finally, he spoke. "She has everything she needs here." Elias tilted his head slightly. "Does she?" A pause followed. Not dramatic, but precise. Clara shifted her weight subtly, her hands no longer clasped tightly together, but resting loosely at her sides. That small change made the room feel different in a way that could not be ignored. Harland finally stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind him without turning his back on either of them. The sound of the latch clicking into place echoed softly. "You are speaking as if you understand this place," Harland said. Elias replied calmly. "I understand patterns." Harlan's expression tightened slightly, though his tone remained controlled. Patterns? Elias nodded once. People repeat what they are taught until someone shows them something else exists. Clara looked between them, her breathing slower now, more deliberate. She seemed to be listening not just to words, but to something underneath them. Harlan turned his attention toward her again. Clara, go downstairs, he said. The instruction was familiar, automatic, unchanged. But this time, Clara did not respond immediately. That pause, brief as it was, altered the weight of the entire room. Harlan noticed. Elias noticed. Clara noticed that they noticed. I heard you, Clara said softly. Harlan's voice remained steady. Then move. Clara looked toward the door, then toward Elias Boone, then back toward Harlan Pike. For the first time, the sequence did not end in immediate obedience. Instead, she remained still. Not refusing. Not complying. Simply remaining. I have been thinking, Clara said slowly, about what happens when I do exactly what I am told. Harlan did not interrupt. The fact that he did not interrupt was itself a form of control being tested. Clara continued. Nothing changes, she said. Not for me. Not for anyone. Elias remained silent, allowing her words to exist fully without interruption. Harlan's jaw tightened slightly, though his voice remained level. You are not here to change things, he said. Clara looked at him directly now. Then why am I here? The question was simple, but it carried weight that neither repetition nor authority could easily dismiss. A long silence followed. Outside, the rain intensified slightly, tapping harder against the windows, as if the town itself was listening more closely now. Harlan stepped a fraction closer, but still did not raise his voice. You are here because I chose it, he said. Clara did not lower her gaze this time. And if I do not want to be chosen anymore? The question hung in the air longer than anything before it. Elias Boone did not move, but his attention sharpened, fully present now. Harlan stared at Clara for a long moment, as if trying to locate the version of her that had always responded without hesitation. But something had shifted too far for that version to return easily. You are speaking without thinking, Harlan said finally. Clara shook her head slightly. No, she replied quietly. I am thinking for the first time. The room fell into a silence that did not belong to fear, but to transition. Harlan turned his gaze briefly toward Elias, then back to Clara. Something in his control remained intact, but it no longer felt absolute. Elias finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. She is not asking to destroy anything, he said. She is asking to exist outside of permission. Harlan did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked at both of them, standing in positions that no longer matched the order he had built around them. Clara stood no longer as an extension of instruction, but as someone occupying space on her own terms, however uncertain those terms still were. Finally, Harlan exhaled slowly. Not in surrender, but in calculation. This town does not work that way, he said. Elias met his gaze. Then maybe it should not keep working this way. The word settled heavily, not as a challenge, but as observation. Clara looked between them once more, and for the first time, she did not step back when silence filled the room. She remained exactly where she was. And in that stillness, something in Red Hollow quietly stopped being what it had always been. The silence that followed Elias Boone's last words did not feel like an ending. It felt like something suspended, as if the entire room inside the boarding house above Red Hollow Saloon had been held in place by a thread that was now beginning to loosen. Clara Whitmore stood at the center of it all, no longer positioned between two men by circumstance alone, but by choice that still felt unfamiliar in her body. Harlan Pike remained near the door, his posture unchanged, yet something in his stillness had shifted. It was no longer the stillness of control. It was the stillness of calculation, the kind that appears when a man realizes that the outcome he expected is no longer guaranteed. Elias Boone did not move closer to either of them. he simply observed, as if waiting for something that could not be forced into existence, only allowed to surface on its own. Clara was the first to speak again, her voice quieter than before, but steadier than it had been at any point in her life inside Red Hollow. "If nothing changes," she said, "then everything I have been doing has only been survival, not living." The words were not directed at Harland or Elias alone. They were spoken into the space itself, as if testing whether the room would reject them or accept them. Harland's eyes narrowed slightly, but not with anger. With recognition. Not of agreement, but of something slipping beyond his ability to contain it through routine alone. "Survival is what keeps people here," he said evenly. Clara shook her head once, slowly. "No," she replied. "It is what keeps people quiet." That answer lingered longer than any command in the room had ever lasted. Downstairs, faint sounds of the saloon continued, but even those felt distant now, like echoes from a version of the town that had not yet realized it was being questioned. Elias finally stepped a little forward, not toward Harland, not toward Clara, but into the shared space between certainty and change. "What happens next does not have to look like what came before," he said calmly. Harland looked at him directly now. There was no denial in his expression anymore, only resistance to the idea that the structure he had relied on could be interpreted differently by others without his permission. "You speak as if a town changes because people decide it should," Harland said. Elias met his gaze without hesitation. "That is exactly how it changes." Clara turned slightly toward Elias, as if the simplicity of that statement had reached her in a place deeper than fear or habit. "If I stop doing what I am told," she said slowly, "what happens to me?" The question was not asked with defiance. It was asked with uncertainty so long practiced that it felt like identity. Elias did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was steady, not persuasive, not forceful, but grounded. "You find out who you are without permission shaping every step," he said. Harland exhaled through his nose, a controlled breath that carried neither agreement nor denial. He looked at Clara for a long moment, as if searching for the version of her that had existed before questions like this were possible. But she did not lower her gaze. That alone changed the weight in the room again. Clara spoke quietly, almost to herself. "I do not remember making choices," she said. "Only reactions." Elias nodded once. "Then this is where that begins to change." Harland finally stepped back from the doorway slightly. Not a retreat in the traditional sense, but a small redistribution of space, as if the room itself required adjustment for something he had not anticipated. "You think I have kept her silent," he said, his voice lower now. Elias replied simply, "I think the town taught her silence and you maintained it." That distinction hung between them without accusation, only clarity. Clara took a slow breath, longer than any she had allowed herself in years. When she spoke again, her voice was no longer uncertain in the same way. "If I stay quiet," she said, "I disappear." No one responded immediately. Even Harland did not interrupt. The truth of it did not require reinforcement. It only required acknowledgement. Elias finally looked at her directly. "Then do not disappear," he said. Clara's hands, which had remained still for so long, finally relaxed at her sides. It was not dramatic. It was not sudden. It was simply the first time her body did not prepare itself for instruction before action. Harland watched this change carefully, his expression unreadable now, not because he lacked feeling, but because he was witnessing something that did not fit within the structure he had always used to interpret people. Finally, he spoke again, quieter than before. "And if she leaves?" he asked. Elias turned slightly toward him. "Then she leaves," he said. The simplicity of that answer removed the tension that had been built around consequence. It did not erase responsibility. It simply removed ownership. Clara looked between them both, then toward the window where rain continued to fall over Red Hollow. The town still existed. The saloon still operated. The names had not changed. But something inside her understanding of it had shifted beyond return. "I do not know what I will do tomorrow," she said honestly. Elias nodded, That is the first time that has been true. A faint pause followed, not heavy now, but open. Harland remained where he stood, no longer pressing forward, no longer demanding. Immediate response from a world that was no longer responding automatically. Clara stepped slowly toward the window, not away from either man, but toward something that had not been available to her before. She looked out at the wet streets, the dim lanterns, the town that had contained her life without ever asking if she agreed to it. Behind her, Elias Boone and Harland Pike remained in silence, but it was no longer the same silence that had defined them before. It was no longer control. It was uncertainty. And in that uncertainty, Clara Whitmore spoke her final words of the night, not as a question, not as permission, but as recognition. Then I will find out who I am when I am not being told. No one stopped her. And for the first time in Red Hollow, that absence of interruption felt like the beginning of something no one there had been prepared to name.